the younger involved in this intergenerational movement to lift the blockade and to normalize Cuba. And I was able to travel twice last year, and I'm also helping coordinate May Day Brigade that NNOC runs this year. And me, as a young person in the US, it is hard to find for a future in this country with, the constant mass violence, the threat of the climate crisis, and so much more. And going to Cuba shows us that a different type of future is possible. And so that's what we're here to talk about. We're going to talk about their experiences organizing in support of Cuba, traveling to Cuba, and what US youth learn from Cuba and how we can work together with Cuban youth. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to my co-chair, Shivani, who will launch into our first.
Absolutely. Shivani Parikh, she, her, hers, co-chair of the National Affairs Guild at Fordham Law School. We've been thrilled to be able to collaborate with US-Cuba Normalization. And I can go into more detail about who I am during the break because we are already running over time. So I'm going to kick it off starting with Mia, and what we are going to do as each person is asked a directed question is they will briefly share their name, if they had the opportunity to travel to Cuba and when, and which organization they're affiliated with. And then they will jump into the answer to the question. So starting with Mia, my question to you is, what role do Cuban youth play in the Cuban Revolution? How are Cuban youth's experiences engaging with their government and democratic processes different from the youth which are experiencing living under the US empire? Take it away.
Thank you to both co-chairs. Thank you to the organizations that are here. My name is Mia. I work at the People's Forum, and I have been to Cuba. I went the last May Day, and I went in November for a youth exchange conference. So I want to begin by just saying quickly, I know we don't have that much time, but in this context, the US consistently ranks as one of the lowest percentages of youth voter turnout in the entire world. So that's also between the ages of 18 and 35, which is like a large amount of people. And the US kind of likes to rest on this opportunity to vote every 4 years for president of basically one political party as the sort of like kernel of its democracy, so much so that we seek to export it and force it onto other countries across the world. But going to Cuba has taught me that as somebody who grew up in the belly of the beast, you need to be able to expand what you understand as democracy beyond what Western bourgeois liberal democracy tells you that it is. So when I was in Cuba, we got to witness the municipal elections that just happened in November. And municipal elections are seen as sort of like the highest expression of Cuban socialist democracy because these people who are nominated as delegates to be the municipal assemblies of people's power are people who are elected by their neighbors. So neighborhood councils that meet, people get nominated by other people in their community based on their community achievement, how much they've served the community, whether they're willing and able to accept the nomination. And in Cuba, there's no campaigning allowed at this level of elections. So you also go into it accepting your nomination, knowing that if you accept that if you win, you will serve for 5 years in a non-professional manner. So you don't get paid. It's part of your voluntary work. You represent your community at the level of municipal assemblies, which is how their democracy is kind of built upon that. And from there, they elect to like a larger level, to a regional level, and to the national level. So this is like the very foundation of people who select people like the president, who ratify and consult on the Constitution and laws. And so when we went there, all we saw outside of the polling station was just like very simple one-page biographies of people. And then people go in and they choose who they want based on who they know and their experiences with people. And one of the people who were up for election was only 22 years old. And in Cuba, you're automatically registered to vote at 16, and you're able to be nominated to an elected position at 18 years old. So it's very clear that the protagonism and development of the youth is facilitated and encouraged heavily in Cuban society. With some statistics, so of the people who were elected, 44% of them were women and 17% were young people under the age of 50. And Cuba is about to prepare for their national election, which is sort of like the bulwark of their government. And for that, the candidates, 1/5 of them are between the ages of 18 and 35, and more than half of those candidates are women. So it's this really organic process that we got to witness, where people understand that their democracy is bottom up and not top down. And so this is like all these assemblies is not even to speak of different mass organizations like the Federation of Women, high school and college student organizations, trade unions, farmers collectives, and then also committees for the defense of the revolution, which are, if you are interested in mutual aid in this country, the CDRs are a little bit more revolutionary and explicitly political than that, but it's like mutual aid organizers like dream come true with the CDRs. And then I don't want to go over time, but I just think it's important to note that like my final point is that there are so many different levels and processes and mechanisms for democracy to be exercised in Cuban society, and that these things are contradictory under the system. It's important for us to walk away from the fact that this level of democracy can only be achieved with organized society under the system of socialism.
Thank you so much, Anita. Just before we jump to the next question, forgot to mention this, but just since we have very little time, when speakers hit 1 minute and 30 seconds, we'll like make a little sound on the table. And then when you hit 2 minutes, we'll do it again, just to make sure we're staying on time. Thank you again. Our next question is directed towards Angie. So Angie, we want to ask you about the ways to engage in the Cuba Solidarity movement on social media, which of course is the main way that young people learn about news and about what's going on in the world, and also where the US is waging a lot of propaganda against Cuba. So today, a lot of activism on social media is also highly performative. So we want to ask you about how to create an ethical movement online that is, centering the Cuban people, centering solidarity, and how do we win this battle of ideas on social media and counteract US propaganda effectively?
Thank you. That's a big question. And I think it's important to note that we only have 2 minutes each to speak about it, which is about how much time you have on social media. You actually have about 30 seconds to engage someone in an idea, right? So that's important. I just want to get a foundation here. So how many people use Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook? Show of hands. All right. How many people get their news from Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook? It's at least a starting point. Okay, go ahead. Good, because you should be with Breakthrough News. That 10 seconds out there. Right now, who had someone teach you how to use social media? No one, right? Even those of us who grew up with it, we taught ourselves, which means that we are battling a lack of literacy. Not just literacy within this country, because 54% of our community, our society, 54% of people have a literacy rate of a 12-year-old, that's 6th grade, right? So that's effectively half of our population. On top of that, you don't have literacy when it comes to engaging with social media. And by that, I mean clickbait headlines, fake news, right? We've heard about deep fakes. Those are the videos where somebody else is looking like, I don't want to say his name, Donald Trump or Joe Biden, right? And it's really hard to tell what's real and what's not. And that's even me, who spends a lot of my time studying it. I have definitely shared an Onion article myself being like, this is crazy, because actually reality seems that crazy. And I think, thank you. I think when we look at how to use social media effectively, we must know how it works, and that it is one big advertisement. So we are up against being fast, being clean, looking good as a movement, right? I mean that. Really think about your design. If it wouldn't stop you, if you're scrolling and you wouldn't stop for it, don't put it up. I'm being serious. That is just a waste of your time. And actually working collaboratively. in the fact that there are actually a lot of us online, and a lot of us have friends who may not even be in the movement, but every piece of Cuba is is connected to every piece of someone's life, right? So maybe you're not a socialist, but you know someone with diabetes, right? So you can connect with people and they're organizing around their everyday needs, and we need to activate everyone around us, including our friends and family, even if they're not with it, right? So one more knock. And I think that's it. We need to coordinate. Before we leave the conference today, every group needs to exchange social media so that we can have one big media task force, so that we're all moving as one. Because there's the illusion of the internet that things are bigger than they are, and we are actually bigger than we are in this room. And we can do that if we organize effectively.
Now, on the theme of connection, next question is for Kaleem. Kaleem, how are the Cuban and Palestinian liberation struggles connected? What can the Cuba Solidarity Movement learn from your experiences organizing for Palestine? How can we work together more and build a global movement against imperialism?
You guys, hi everyone. My name is Kaleem. I'm Palestinian Parliament. I'm really glad to be here. I've been to Cuba once as a child. Interestingly, we have a sort of long lost side of our family that were exiled to Cuba from Palestine and lived there for decades now. And we're not in touch with them, but we know about their existence. So maybe one day chance to meet. Again, it's a short amount of time. I just want to talk a little bit about what unites the two struggles and the importance of solidarity between them. I think what unites at the most fundamental level Cuba and Palestine is that they are sites of resistance to the dominant systems of imperialism and capitalism, and they're being punished for that. And I think nothing threatens U.S. empire more than and other groups that engage in that. I think it's important that we don't whitewash that element of the history and of the connection between the groups. For me, what was very, and for the other Palestinians from our movement who are here, I think it's hard for us not to think of Gaza when we're at a space like this one. Obviously, the conditions are different and the histories are different, but we just wanted to take this opportunity to reaffirm like the importance of keeping Gaza in our memories and in our struggles and in our communication as movements, because of the genocidal blockade that has been in place against the people of Gaza for so long. I think as Palestinians, we also recognize the decades-long solidarity that Cuba has demonstrated for Palestine. Cuba was one of the earliest to vote against the UN partition plan. They've affirmed votes saying that Zionism is racism. They offer material support for Palestinian students to come study for free in Cuba, and they've also offered material support to Palestinian resistance itself during the moments of our revolutionary struggles. Sadly, it's not being reciprocated right now by the illegitimate Palestinian Authority that is in charge of Palestine. They are signatories to various economic treaties that are essentially upholding the blockade of Cuba. This is something that we are fighting against as a movement and that we're committed to being in struggle against. So that's why it's very important for us to be here, to be learning about what it is that the Cuban people and Cuban organizers are asking of us to do to be in solidarity with you all. And I guess what we would offer in return for us to think about is when you're ending Palestinian liberation, what that means for those who aren't Palestinian is a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, as well as making sure that Palestinian resistance in all its movements, so people's right to resist in all ways. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaleem. Our next question I want to direct to Noah, who's part of an incredibly vibrant anti-imperialist in Western Massachusetts. And you have experience organizing on campus against the blockade. So What has your experience been? Why is organizing students and campuses important? And what kind of advice would you give to youth who might be hesitant to get involved in these kind of struggles because of the political or the career, the social ramifications that come with, participating in the struggle against US imperialism?
Yes, wonderful. Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is Noah. I use he, they pronouns. I've unfortunately never been to Cuba, but I would love to go on brigade one day. I can't go in May, but someday in the summer, perhaps. I am representing the Young Democratic Socialists of America. And to address the first question, the exciting news is that more than ever, young people are open to the idea of socialism. Young people are organizing for socialist values. And this is very exciting, but energy is not enough, as we all know. We need coordinated action on a collective mass scale. And to do that, we need to build organizations. And so building a YDSA chapter on my campus has been really, really powerful for building a home for the left, which has allowed us to run large-scale campaigns to deliver wins for the working class, both on our campuses, but also internationally. I was part of a movement to organize a standout for Cuba at the University of Massachusetts Amherst with Massachusetts Peace Action. And also DSA nationally is involved with international organizing to end the blockade. And I think campus organizing is super important because we have a unique position as students to make radical change. Dating way back to the history of the Vietnam War or the Iraq War, students were critical in fighting against those wars. And I think that students have the ability to organize powerful pressure campaigns on our elected officials, on our student governments, on our university administrators to call for an end to the blockade, to call for increased travel opportunities to Cuba, to remove, Cuba off this ridiculous state sponsors of terrorism list. And I think ultimately, when we are divided and unorganized, we are weak. But when we come together and are organized, we can do anything. And in terms of the last question, what advice would I give to people who are afraid to get involved in this movement? I would say that we can't be afraid of getting involved in the anti-imperialist struggle because our struggle against capitalism, white supremacy, racism, and cis heteropatriarchy are intimately tied with the struggle against imperialism because settler colonial imperialism is what birthed all of these different systems of oppression. And we cannot be free unless we free Cuba from this ridiculous imperialist crusade and US hegemony that they've been oppressed for decades now. At a time when women's and LGBTQ rights are under attack in the US, Cuba has made enormous strides towards LGBT and women's liberation. And I think that, they've also made huge strides towards guaranteeing healthcare and education for all, eradicating illiteracy and poverty, and most importantly, building a kinder and more just political and economic system. And so I would say, lastly, we must be bold as people living in the imperial metropole and organize in solidarity with our Cuban siblings so that one day we might all be free. Thank you.
Excellent. And so that brings us to our final question for Jacob. I just wanted to give everybody a sense of where we're headed. So at 3:15, we will stop taking questions from the audience briefly, only to flip our panel for 5 more young folks, then be directed questions, and then furthermore answer some. We understand that the schedule has allocated time from 3:30 to 4 p.m. We hope that you won't mind that we're planning on taking half of that time away from you. So we will give you a 15-minute break rather than a 30. But still value your ability to take care of yourselves in the interim. That being said, I'm going to pivot to my last question for Jacob. So in the belly of the beast, it's easy to feel like there's no hope for the future. How does Cuba show us what sort of future is possible? These are hard, and it seems like liberation is out of reach. How do you stay motivated and keep organizing? How does Cuba show us what sort of future is possible? Thank you.
Everyone, I'm Jacob Buckner from the Young Communist League in Cuba C. I've never been to Cuba, but I really want as well. And like another comrade said, really what Cuba represents is actual real democracy, a real process of collective organizing and collective struggles to attain socialism. And an important aspect of that is the youth and the youth's role within the revolutionary kind of process. And so even starting from 1959 onward, teaching, having 18,000 schools open in Cuba, having mass literacy campaigns. It set the stage and the foundation for the revolutionary Cuban government to value youth as a central component of progress, building the socialist system. Set that as a character within the revolution. And so what's really amazing is to see this continue today, that within the electoral struggle, within participation, within the unions, within the municipal elections, within every component of government participation, youth are taking an active role building socialism. This is incredible. I had a comrade that recently went to Cuba and got to witness the municipal elections. And she said that all three of the candidates were under 30 and women organizers. And that represents that these are not just organizers, these are people who are helping their community by building an economic system which is the best for the collective. And so all of these achievements are only possible under socialism, only possible because having vaccines for everyone, curing lung cancer, ending COVID, sending doctors all over the world, all of these things represent the collective urgency of the youth in building the system. And this is completely on the completely different than our economic system, in which under capitalism, we feel stripped of our right to organize. We are dispossessed both through evictions, literal dispossession, and also our right to organize, our right to be agents within the political system. So we have a world to learn from Cuba because it really represents not only valuing youth, but seeing them as a central component within this struggle. And yeah, thanks.
This time, we will take only 2 questions from the audience. The second, thanks for humoring us. Go ahead.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to say that actually the youth were the most disciplined at starting the workshops on time. So thank you, youth. So, the other workshops are probably going to go until 4 or 4:15. So if you want to extend some possibilities.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So that'll give us the opportunity to run until, let's say, 3:50. Yeah, because we'll be splitting 40-40. We can go through, so we can take probably 4 questions.
Okay, lucky.
So who would like to, please, you may just direct it to any of our folks here. Could we just state your name again for the benefit of the audience?
Noah.
Yeah.
Jacob.
Angie.
Excellent. Go ahead, sir.
I'm a member of the Radical Elders, the Young Division. Website, radicalelders.net. My question had to do with, I want to address this to Angie and others, the role of music in organizing. I was dismayed at the Grammys. They had an Afro-Cuban group talking about democracy in Cuba, but they were counter-revolutionary.
Mhm.
Is there a possibility of songs emanating from this organizing, whether in English or Spanish, that could also be used in social media, et cetera, et cetera? So it's a call for your creative mind. That's all I want to say. Thank you. My name is Angel Roman, he, him, his.
Wow, what a question.
Long run, right?
Yeah, anyone who wants to chime in, go ahead. I mean, I think we saw that with Yo2L, right? 2 years ago, they were being funded and backed by the US. They're over there, I think, pleading in Paris, saying, please, intercede. So, I mean, those kinds of groups are definitely being funded and provided for by the US. We definitely know people in our communities that are artists, creators, and make beautiful music that actually support the revolution. As far as how to break into the scene, I mean, all we can do is use our own spaces and promote it. But I think being effective in telling people, was it Patria Vida, was not the song of Cuba, the way that it was portrayed in the US, and us doing effective campaigns to dispel that, to expose it, is the best that we can do besides lifting the people that we know. I don't really know if there's anything I can contribute to that, but good question.
You, would anyone else like to add a response to that question before we take another?
Yeah, I would just add that in the times that I've visited Cuba and from what I know about its historical process, culture has always been a huge political priority of the government of Cuba. Even a little bit of history, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and Cuba lost a lot of its sort of both material and financial aid that it was relying on, Fidel never once cut any of the cultural programs that were being funded by the government. Because he knew that culture was the core of the revolution and that the people were not going to back the revolution unless you provide them and resource them with the things that make them human, the things that make them enjoy life. And when we went to the medical school, there was performances obviously for us, but it wasn't, you know, when you go to like a school or university in the United States and there's students who are performing, it's like clear sort of like tokenization of like, oh, these are our students, they're doing like this performance. But it was truly like, there was a student from Syria who wanted to sing a song. There were indigenous students from Colombia who did traditional dance for us, but all the other students were there. There was no stage. We were all there in the crowd together. It was really just a celebration of culture that is intimately weaved into their society that we severely lack here.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more question from the audience. Go ahead.
So get my question down, sort of lost. But originally, Marxism and socialism, at least for the old dominants, like Trotsky.
Can you speak up a little?
Yeah. So originally, Marxism and socialism, at least for the old style Marxists, like and Trotsky, Luxemburg, and Marx himself, meant the working class struggle for political power, aka the dictatorship of the proletariat, for the purposes of abolishing capitalism. And so keeping that in mind, what does it mean that Cuba is now seeking to normalize relations with the US? Why is it necessary for Cuba to open negotiations with the US government? And what does that mean about Cuba's ostensible revolution? Just for context here, the Soviet Union, for example, by 1921, shortly after the workers and peasants of the country successfully seized political power, was forced to introduce capitalist relations into the economy. And Lenin, in his notes of a publicist, very clearly calls this a retreat and not an advance of the revolution. Why do the panelists here, who see themselves as socialists and or Marxists, think Lenin as a socialist and Marxist? I believed it was so important to clarify this, and what was at stake. That's my question.
I can go and take this one. So a couple of reasons. I think it's very important for us to keep in mind that the anti-colonial struggle against colonialism and imperialism is intimately tied with the struggle for Marxism and socialism. You can't divorce the two. And I think that Cuba, with the sanctions that are being placed on it right now, like just look at the mass death that's being caused because of the United States. You know, the lack of ability to get basic medicine, basic food, basic farming equipment, things that a society needs to develop into socialism, where we can guarantee things like healthcare and housing and all these wonderful things to everybody. Despite this blockade, Cuba has made enormous steps at eradicating illiteracy, eradicating poverty, and making sure that every single person in Cuba has a respectable standard of living to the extent that they're able to. And I think there's a lot of historical implications for after the fall of the Soviet Union. We live in a world that's dominated by neoliberal capitalism, and that, there's the aid of the Soviet Union is gone. Cuba needs to have ways to develop itself as a country, getting capital into the country. It's being starved right now. And if we don't support them in solidarity, it's the starvation of this revolution. It's the victory of colonialism in Cuba. And I think that it is of utmost importance for any Marxist to be completely dedicated to the anti-colonial struggle that Cuba is leading.
Thank you so much, everyone. Please, for all of our panelists. We are requesting all of y'all to please take your water bottles with you and join the audience. We are bringing up now 5 more individuals. So if Jameer, Natalia, Michael, Richie, and Gabby could all come up. Switcheroo.
And also, while we have this pause, we'd love to acknowledge our Cuban guests in the corner of the room. Thank you so much for being here. All right, I think we are ready to get started with round 2. So it's gonna be the same thing. We'll direct individual questions to you. You'll have about 2 minutes to respond. We'll let you know when you're getting close to time. And then we'll take questions from the audience. And please, when you're answering your question, just introduce yourself, what organization you're with. So our first question is for Natalia, who I was with in the November US Youth Friendship meeting. And Natalia, after the Youth Friendship meeting, you wrote an article about how the blockade on Cuba prevents life-saving US medicines from being imported to Cuba, but it also prevents Cuban medicines that could save thousands of lives in the US from being imported here. So how are US and Cuban youth both impacted by the US blockade? And what might US youth be surprised to learn about the daily experience of living under these violent sanctions?
Thank you so much, Kala, for the introduction. My name is Natalia. I'm an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and I'm also a journalist with People's Dispatch. And thank you for mentioning the article. So I wrote in particular about how the US blockade of Cuba affects medical patients in both the US and Cuba. And Cuba has been in dire medical straits before. Communist socialists in the US have had to donate insulin to Cuba during the special period right after the fall of the Soviet Union. But now we have the opposite problem, right? Where the Cuban medical system has succeeded so much that they're actually developing cures for diseases that ravage the working class in the country. Diseases like diabetes, for example. In the United States, doctors describe for Black working class neighborhoods as war zones because of how many people are missing limbs because of diabetic amputation. Cuban doctors have been able to develop a medical treatment that will reverse the process of disease that leads to amputations, but we're not able to access it in the United States. That's just part of the way that the blockade affects everyone. But I do want to emphasize, when we're talking about whether youth or adults or any generation really, the US blockade of Cuba is not just a blockade of goods and services, it's primarily a blockade of ideas, right? So there's a lot that there are a lot of lies that we're told about socialism in this country, right? Like my entire life I've been hearing socialism looks really good on paper, but it doesn't work in practice, right? Who here has heard that? I think we've all heard something along those lines, right? But in Cuba, when you go to Cuba, that's exposed as a lie, right? And you get exposed to ideas that are basically banned in the United States, right? So, whether these ideas are banned in law or in everything but law, you get exposed to really radical, revolutionary, quite frankly, unrealistic ideas like everyone deserves to eat, or people deserve medicine when they're sick, even if they can't afford it, or people deserve a roof over their heads, right? These are really insane ideas, right? We can't even think about them here today, but I do also want to emphasize that, an idea that was told to me by a Cuban youth is this idea of revolution as a process, right? So a Cuban youth told me that they don't consider 1959 to be the revolution. They consider it to be the triumph of the revolution because revolution happened before 1959, it happened during 1959, and it's still happening today in Cuba. That's right. And I think that revolution as a process is an idea that we're not exposed to today. That sounds very unfamiliar to us, right? Here in the US, it's 1776. That was the American Revolution. We're done. We don't need more revolution. We don't need more change. But in Cuba, you learn that Cuban society is ever changing, ever growing, ever moving forward. And I think that's really the crux of what the blockade is really about. It's about banning a dialogue between a working class that has triumphed and a working class that will triumph. And so that's really to me what it's about. And just to touch on the last part of the question, Cuban youth experience a lot of hardships, a lot of things that we take for granted in the United States, electricity, public transportation, access to different websites, like Zoom is banned in Cuba for some reason. So, there's so much that we take for granted that we really have to keep in mind that Cuban youth are struggling against sanctions, and we also have to struggle against sanctions as well. So, yeah.
Our next question is for Gabby. Young people are at the forefront of this huge surge of labor organizing in the United States. What was your experience like meeting with Cuban labor organizers and union members, like the bakers and rail workers unions? In a country like the United States, where labor organizing is violently suppressed, what can we learn from Cuban unions?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Gabby Prosser. I'm a member of the Socialist Workers Party in Minneapolis. I work in an industrial bakery, member of Local 22 of the Bakery, Confectionery, Tobacco and Grain Millers Union there. I just returned from Cuba. I was there for 3 weeks, participating in the Havana International Book Fair with Pathfinder Press Stand. And over those 3 weeks, we had many different exchanges with Cuban working people and youth. We met with leaders of the UJC, or the Young Communists, leaders of FAU, University Students Federation, and we were invited to the University for International Relations, where we had a rich exchange with the students there. You can read about that exchange in this week's issue of the Militant newspaper. But we also met with leaders of Cuba's union of food workers and transportation workers. And we spent a day in the countryside with ANAP, which is the National Association of Small Farmers, to learn directly from working farmers at an agricultural cooperative. So it's important to recognize production in Cuba is not organized to increase the wealth of an individual or a small minority like it is here. Production is organized for the benefit of the Cuban people. They're the ones, as they confront Washington's 60-year-long bipartisan economic and political war against them, they're working to increase production of food and other necessities. And it's the workers and farmers who are in Cuba who are on the front lines of the solution. Unions in Cuba, like here, are workers' organizations, and they have a completely different relationship with the government. The workers and farmers government. This is what makes Cuba different from every other country in the world. The means of production belong to the working people. And in the opening years of the revolution, they organized and mobilized to take control of the factories, sugar mills, and plantations. Recently, in the bakery where I work at, a coworker of mine's hand got mangled in a machine that didn't have protective guards on it. In response, we went through our union to put signs on it and work on the dangerous machines, despite the boss's protests. But it showed, in my workplace, why a union was important. So, and things like this happen all the time under capitalism. And I asked the union secretary in Cuba how they confront unsafe working conditions, and he responds that it does not get to that point. Workers have control of production on the floor, something we need to fight for here. We have to fight for production, because production is done for man instead of for the accumulation of wealth for an individual for profit. How much time is that in?
Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm really sorry we don't have more time. I wish we could hear from you guys longer, but we do have to move on to our next question. Thank you, Gabby. Our next question is. Thank you. Our next question is directed towards Jamir. So you've had the experience of traveling to Cuba several times with different brigades. So what was your experience on these trips, especially your last time in Cuba for the US-Cuba Youth Friendship Meeting, a historic exchange between US and Cuban youth? And what opportunities are there for young people to travel to Cuba, like the people in this room who might be interested?
Yeah. Thank you for that. It's an honor to be part of this panel. Hi, everybody. My name is Jamir. I'm part of different groups. I'm part of the Cuba C Coalition that we organize the rallies here. in conjunction with Puentes de Amor in Miami, and I'm also part of Troika Collective, which is a group of radical Latino youth from Miami, from the 305. But I'm from the 718, so I'm representing my comrades out there. But anyways, yes, I've had the pleasure to be in Cuba 3 times. Once with the Venceremos Brigade, another time with the Mayday Brigade, and just recently on this youth summit back in November. And it was a marvelous experience, engaging with Cuban youth, being myself a youth from the United States, but of Latin American background. Usually, like from our backgrounds, we usually, our families get like propaganda from news stations like Telemundo or Univision, that communism and socialism is bad for Cuba and bad for Latin America. So that's why we have to God bless that we're hearing oh dear Uncle Sam. But anyways, being in Cuba and engaging with the youth, I'm always surprised of the amount of knowledge that the youth have. And for me, I love knowledge. You know, like I'm somebody that came into like politics through hip hop, listening through hip hop music, out in the Bronx, being part of hip hop collectives, and always loving to absorb knowledge. So when I hear youth in a third world country like Cuba, an island, you know, with this socialist project, repeating points like, I remember I spoke to one youth and I told them, oh, when I went to Hunter College, they were like, oh, that's a CUNY. Oh, wow, how did you know that? Amazing. Or they would tell me stuff about New York or working class history in the United States. So I found it amazing. And also just their in like how broad their scope is of the world. But like the part I found kind of like saddening or negative is just the effects of the blockade. Like it limits them to their ability of like what they want to do with their lives, like social projects. Because I mean, not everybody, I mean, it is good that everybody has the freedom to become a doctor or a teacher, but not everybody wants that, you know? And some other people have other social projects. Like that's the thing when we talk about the arts, you know, a lot of artists find a lot of like problems, like trying to move forward with their music. And sometimes they have to leave the island because of that. So I've seen that like with the youth. I feel that it's like my responsibility to be here in the belly of the beast, to speak about the truth that they're living in Cuba, but also speak about the positivities of the revolution. Because one thing I've learned in Cuba is that, and everybody has told about the history of Cuba, but the way I always like to think about Cuba, I don't know if anybody ever seen Godfather Part 2. Like Godfather Part 2 is like a good metaphor of how Cuba was before the revolution. It was like a mafia playground colony for the mafia class. You see it in the scene where they're cutting up the cake in front of the Fulgencio Batista's people. That's a good metaphor of how Cuba was. And then there's a part in the movie, which I like, where they flee out because Fidel and the revolutionaries triumph. You know, so that to me is the metaphor that revolution sends to the United States, is that Cuba will be nobody's casino ever again. That the resources of Cuba will be distributed amongst her children. So, yes. There are many, just quickly, there are many different ways for youth to go to Cuba. As I hope all the youth here learn about the different brigades that are going, that are planning to go to Cuba, whether it's the Venceremos Brigade, if called Pass for Peace, Mayday Brigade, and hopefully other groups are organizing. I know the People's Forum also organizes brigades towards Cuba. Oh, Code Pink as well.
Yeah, and come to the Solidarity Travel Workshop after this to learn more about all those brigades. Thank you.
Yes, our next question is for Richie. Richie, LGBTQ plus liberation is deeply important to youth in the United States. The United States has slid back LGBTQ plus rights and launched actually a nationwide assault on trans people in recent years. Cuba has passed some of the most progressive laws in the world on LGBTQ rights. What might the United States youth and queer people around the world be inspired to learn from Cuba?
Thank you. So hi, everyone. My name is Richie. I'm a member of Workers' World Party. I'm from the Bronx, New York, and consider myself an anti-war, anti-imperialist activist. And I do a lot of work in the Bronx. So to talk about LGBTQ rights in Cuba, in September, Cuba passed a family code, which I'm sure a lot of people here are very familiar with. It enshrines the rights of, everyone knows that gay marriage, if you read the US media, it'll say, oh, gay marriage was legalized, right? But it doesn't really give this piece of legislation and constitutional change justice. So what it really does is that it really just enshrines the right of queer people, trans people to have families and to change the definition of what a family is from to be more of a relationship of responsibility. So that responsibility can take so many different forms. It's not just like mother, father, and child. It could be like your chosen family as well. So you can create a family with people that are not related to you by blood, and you'll still have the same rights as a family. In Cuba, LGBTQ people have free healthcare. They have including gender affirming care, free education, including comprehensive sex education, the right to housing and work, and dignity for all. When I was in Cuba as an LGBTQ person, I was in the eastern part of Cuba, so I never went to La Habana, but I was in Guantanamo, Camagüey, Holguín, Santiago, and these are like not the, hip, they're not known to be like the hippest parts of Cuba. But what I found while I was over there is that didn't matter. I felt completely safe. I felt like I could be myself. And when I went with the Venceremos Brigade, which is a very diverse group of people. Many LGBTQ people were there, trans people were part of the brigade, and we all felt very safe. We all felt very comfortable walking the streets of Cuba at night. Last thing I'll say is that we had the chance to meet with the LGBTQ community there as well. So one of my memories that I'll take away with me from this trip is hearing the experiences of this young trans woman who had just finished her college degree. She majored in psychology. And when we were asking her to come, to talk about the struggles that she experiences as a trans woman in Cuba, she told us, transphobia still exists here, right? We're still trying to, make those, part of the revolution includes a social revolution as well, ensuring that people no longer hold these like transphobic or homophobic viewpoints, which, by the way, were brought over through colonialism and capitalism. It's not inherent to the people of Cuba or to any people in general, but he told us that, right now, like our biggest struggle right now is with this discrimination. But she told us that I don't have to fear for my life here in Cuba, like trans people in the United States do. In the United States, trans people are really like struggling to survive, to get jobs, to get housing. But she said here in Cuba, I have a job. I just finished my degree. I have housing, and we don't let people sleep on the streets. And also, she had mentioned that part of the family code, it also protects young LGBTQ people from being disowned by their parents, because if a young LGBTQ person is disowned by their parents, that's considered domestic violence in Cuba, and they will be dealt with through laws. So she said that, like, while we still have this stigma, that we might experience at school or at work, it does not compare to what trans people in the United States experience.
Thank you so much, Richie, for that amazing explanation of the Families Code, which is such a comprehensive piece of legislation that it's really worth looking into more in depth if people have the time. Just to add quickly, one of the most interesting parts of the Families Code is that it removes the idea of parental custody, making, children their parents' property, and rather puts forth the idea and the concepts of parental responsibility, the responsibility to make their children happy and healthy and safe. And there's so much more. So definitely worth looking into, asking our Cuban comrades about the Families Code, and learning about what could be possible here in the US. So our final question before we open it up to audience questions, I'm going to direct to Mike from Canada, who has experience traveling to Cuba and organizing in the Cuba Solidarity Movement. So Mike, what is your what is your advice to young people who are looking to get involved in this solidarity movement? What sort of organizations can we get involved in? Why is it important for young people especially to participate? And how can we build a movement across North America, across the US, across Canada, across all of Latin America and the Caribbean to end the blockade?
Hello, everyone. It's nice to see you all here. My name is Mike Larson. I'm a member of Fire This Time Movement for Social Justice, as well as Friends of Cuba against the US blockade in Vancouver. First, I'd like to thank the US-Cuba Normalization for organizing this educational conference. It's a great honor to be here today with so many other young activists, organizers, especially who are inspired by revolutionary Cuba, revolutionary internationalism, especially as we work together in a united front to defend Cuba's self-determination. Cuba's socialist revolution, of course, has been under 60 years of an unjust, moral, and brutal blockade. I've traveled to Cuba 6 times with the Che Guevara Work Brigade, the Garcia Brigade, Coast Passes for Peace Caravan. In February, I had the chance of joining the first international meeting of theoretical publications of parties, movements of the left, member of the Fire This Time delegation. I got involved in Cuba solidarity work through high school, actually, because myself and a group of like-minded students decided to form a political discussion group, which we would have discussions after history class. Through that, I wanted to be involved in something that was more of a revolutionary perspective, involved action-oriented events. So through learning about Cuba, I saw the revolution as an inspiration, and it was an example for myself and a lot of young people back in Vancouver. Cuba is an example of building a better world, as most of the panelists have said today. Friends of Cuba against the US blockade was first organized as the Free the Cuban 5 Committee Vancouver. And basically, we organized 110 protests in front of the US consulate demanding the freedom of the Cuban 5. And through the work of our work, as well as the international committees, we saw those 5 heroes return back to Cuba. And so that great victory achieved, our sights are now pointed towards the US blockade. We've always pushed for educating and organizing for Cuba in a more consistent, coordinated, and creative ways. In Canada, we built Cuba Solidarity as a united front in Canada, the US, as well as with international organizations. US blockade is consistent in its brutality with Cuba. We must be consistent and united in our response to be effective. This is a type of dynamic campaign that needs the energy and enthusiasm of youth, especially a lot of the youth that are here in this conference today. But we can definitely benefit from a lot of the experienced organizers that are part of this conference as well. So I'm looking forward to discussing more about Cuba with all of you. And especially I wanted to talk about the postcard campaign that we have launched with New York and New Jersey Cuba C and Friends of Cuba against the US blockade Vancouver, which we are asking President Biden lift Cuba off the list of state-sponsored. So please take a chance to go to our table and sign this postcard because it's very important and it's a very strong campaign that we can definitely unite around. So I'd like to say thank you for having me today.
Incredible. And so we will take the next 10 minutes to take questions from the audience.
all at once.
Let's start here.
I was looking for a microphone, but I guess we're yelling. Okay, I was struck by a couple of things that were said at the panel this morning by the very many speakers we heard from. One was in Sandra Levinson's opening comments on the exchange she relayed she had heard between young Cuban Americans in Cuba and Fidel, where he said that we don't really need you here, we need you there, helping to fight. I've heard other people who explained that same sentiment by other Cubans. Thanks, that's very kind of you, we're doing okay, but what we really need is for you to go back there. And I put that together with another comment someone made about how Cuba is a threat to the whole US ruling class. He explained it as both Democrats and Republicans because of the hope it gives to Latin America and the possibility of emulating. And I would add that to say the hope it gives to working people and youth in this country and other places as well. Everything we talk about in Cuba was made possible because there was a revolution. Can't learn about their medical care or their child care centers or their anything else and transplant it into this country as it is today. You have to go back and do what they did starting before 1959 through today. So I'm wondering if the speakers could comment on that. This group up here, or perhaps also the other group that was up here earlier, on that combination of things.
Have two folks answer and starting in the time.
Yeah, I think on that point, I was very amazed when I went to Cuba in November at like the enormous trust that the Cubans place in US youth. I remember asking like Cuban scientists who was doing research on, diabetes and lung cancer about what we can do to like help support their science. And she looked at me and she just said, well, I mean, other than lifting the blockade, like, you think I can lift the blockade? Okay. And we can though. That's the thing, right? Like we do have enormous power in this country, not just as youth, but as workers. And I think that we have to, we have to be honored by the enormous responsibility that Cuban people place in our hands and that the trust that they place in us as well, that we can actually succeed and we can actually triumph in this country, and take that with us in all the work that we do.
The most important thing we can do in defense of the Cuban Revolution is build the type of party here that can be the socialist revolution, working class party. And to bring the lessons from Cuba, the concrete realities of Cuba here and talk with our coworkers and fellow workers and youth about that, show that there's something fighting for. Cuba shows us of our capacity to transform society and what's possible.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. Are there any other questions from the audience? Hi.
Yeah, so a lot of times when I've done organizing around youth communities in my own community, there's a lot of sort of imperialist propaganda that remains in youth minds of Cuba as this like storied dictatorship to our south. So what have you found is like has been the best method in your work to really show other youth the realities about Cuba before they've even seen Cuba, and to like really relate the struggles of the revolution to their own personal struggles?
It would be great if actually the three remaining panelists could each answer this question.
I think from our own experience back home in Canada, it's one of the most important aspects is to bring up a lot of the gains of the revolution in terms of the fact that when youth in Cuba were very much a big part of a lot of the movements like eradicating illiteracy in Cuba, as well as being part of the medical brigades around the world. They've been into many different countries like Brazil, Pakistan, in which they have gone and have not asked for anything in return. A lot of these countries, Cuba has helped many people, and especially in Latin America, has given free eye surgeries to a lot of people. And that's something where when you contrast that to a country like Canada and the United States, it's like they send military out and they have imperialist war and destruction, in which Cuba brings doctors to people. So that paired with the fact that also students carry a lot of debt. One thing in Cuba that they can't imagine how a wealthy country like Canada and the US does not have universal health care, universal education. So those are very good points that you can bring up with students about Cuba and its revolution.
I think, well, maybe where could I start? Having a conversation of Che Guevara, like I'll be like, hey, you know the guy that they sell like the shirts in the stores and like Walgreens and stuff? Just basically talking about like, because Che is like a symbol of like youth rebellion. Like Che is like that eternal youth that, you know, everybody, you know, wanted to be, you know, once you became like politicized and revolutionized, you know, you wanted to be like Che. Why? Because Che showed this sense of like humanism, you know, coming from a privileged background, you know, and wanting to engage in the Cuban Revolution for Cuba's fight for liberation and freedom and for the new world. I would start, you know, right there talking about history, talking about who Che was, you know, just for folks, just for youth here in the United States that are too stuck on their phones or on Instagram reels, or I don't know what Kanye West is doing. Like talk about like Cuban culture and also like try to win them back with like what the brother right here said about stuff like, you know, why don't we get free healthcare or like have the right to education? Why we have to go into depth to get an education, and why is it free to go into the military and to go kill people in these imperialistic wars? The other end to that too is also talking about, well, if they're not in agreement with socialism, like be in agreement with allowing Cuba to breathe, to not have this blockade, because it's not fair, because there's a part where we have this red scare still of like the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is not here anymore. There's other reasons why, but it still maintains that blockade, and Cuba should be allowed to have the freedom to express itself the way they want to, whether it's for good or for bad. Because Cuba is imperfect. What I want to say is that Cuba's not perfect, but it's okay. Like, that's something I've learned. They've earned that because they're sovereign. It's like Cuba's a nation state. It's a direct nation. It's a nation state that fought against the Spanish Empire. The directly guided nation state was separating from U.S. imperialism. So it's like a David and Goliath type of mindset, you know, to let youth know that you have to support David versus Goliath. But yeah, it's not an easy challenge. And I think the best thing is to try to get youth to come to Cuba, brigades, Venceremos Brigade, Mayday Brigade, and for them to engage more in what other youth are doing in Cuba.
Yeah, I think the best way to get someone to support Cuba is to get them to Cuba. If that's not possible, share your experiences of going to Cuba. And if, you know, that doesn't work, then what I usually ask people is like, because people will say like, oh, don't people not have freedom there? Aren't people like oppressed there? I ask them, I'm like, what do you mean by that? Like what is your definition of freedom? I want to understand what you mean by this. And then they might say like, oh, can't they not vote over there? Like they'll start kind of coming up with all crazy kind of things. And then that's your responsibility. In turn, you're going to say like, well, actually they have elections. They have more of a participatory democratic process than we do here. Describe that, you know, they might say something like, oh, aren't like LGBTQ people oppressed over there? Then you can say, well, actually, like they have free healthcare, free gender affirming healthcare over there. And you know, and then if they say something about like, well, isn't everyone so poor over there? Then you can start talking about the blockade and not only how lifting the blockade would allow Cubans to receive much needed items that, you know, goods and services. But in return, we would get access to the medical advancements that Cuba has made that we currently don't have access to, the diabetes medication that has been brought up, the lung cancer vaccine that has been brought up. So it's really just helping people like to understanding that like what they've heard about Cuba has been wrong, just by, you know, engaging in, you know, with them in good faith and not immediately just being like, everything you heard is a lie, which is true. Everything they have heard is a lie. But, you know, you kind of have to like help them understand that themselves, you know, by asking the right questions.
Thank you so much for those wonderful answers. I think hopefully people will come out of this panel with a lot of good ideas for how to start talking about Cuba to their friends, to their communities, to their classmates. And I'd also add that our organizations all have resources that you can use to educate your friends and your family about Cuba. There's amazing films from Cuba, books, articles, speeches, and events like these where people can come and learn more. So really encourage people to utilize those. And we have time for one more question from the audience, if there are any takers.
All right, my favorite question is just always to ask, like, can you share an anecdote, a favorite experience in Cuba that you had, something that stands out to you?
Well, everybody kind of quickly.
Yeah.
Rapid fire.
Rapid fire. All right, I'll say that I knew a lot about Cuba before going over there. Like I knew a lot of it. So for me, like what shocked me was just seeing how clean the streets are, how there's literally like no trash anywhere. And I was like, whoa, because I've traveled all over Latin America and South America and the Caribbean, and like everywhere you see, there's just so much trash, and it's so, I mean, look at the streets of New York City. Like look, where I'm from in the Bronx, like there's like literally like bags of open trash everywhere on the streets, and like you just don't see that in Cuba because they had the committees for the defense of the revolution. Part of their duties is actually to do neighborhood cleanups, and they're actually going around their community cleaning up their streets because they have pride in what they have and that it's theirs. So that's what impressed me the most.
When you're waiting in a line, you don't line up. But, if you approach the bathroom and say, who's the last one? I mean, I think it's just there's not this cutthroat competition. I know I'm in front of you. Like it's just there's a trusting.
Yeah, speaking along the lines of like Cuban people putting their trust in us in the US, I was interviewing a municipal leader in the neighborhood of La Corbata in Havana. And I was telling her about, as opposed to Cuba in the US, there's not a lot of women in government. There's very low youth voter turnout. We just got our abortion rights stripped away. And she just, told me like, well, what are you doing? Like, you need to do something about that. You need to organize. Like, what are you doing here? And I was like, that drives me, right in the back of my mind, I always hear that woman's voice. Organize.
I guess one thing that Cuba has taught me is that you can blockade a lot of different things, but solidarity cannot be blockaded. I think that a lot because going to Cuba, I feel like Cuba's such a it's very nationalistic. Like people are very proud about their culture, their history, all the mixes, from their Afro culture to their indigenous, to even their Chinese culture. But also that it's very international as well. You get that sentiment. Cuba has made changes throughout the world. I want to repeat. I mean, everybody knows in this room the amazing work they did in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and even here in the US with having asylum with Assata Shakur, our freedom fighter. But yeah, Cuba, like it really shows. It kind of reminds me of like what the apostle Jose Marti once wrote. that patria es humanidad, that homeland is humanity. And those type of words of Jose Marti, it shows in the Cuban people and in their solidarity. So thus, I practice that as much as I can, you know, I'm a human being, but with gatherings like this, organizing the caravans out in the streets every month, you know, whether we think that has effects or not, we're seeing that's having effects because Gusanos are planning their own caravan where they're saying that keep the embargoes. It's crazy, but it's showing that it's working. So, you know, I guess Cuba teaches me that solidarity cannot be blockaded.
My first time in Cuba was very impactful because I had a very interesting discussion with a security guard on the Che Brigade. And he actually fought in Angola as a volunteer. So he would tell me his stories, how in Angola, it led through the Cubans' intervention, it led to the independence of Angola. And on the last day of the trip, he took out a book, Che Guevara's speeches, and gave that to me and said, you have to read this book and understand what Che is saying. Because when you go back to Canada, you have to bring the reality of Cuba there. Tell people in Canada what is really going on in Cuba beyond what the media is saying. So for me, that has always impacted me and has really been inspirational for me to continue my Cuba solidarity work, especially against the bloc.
So much. I guess I'll also share a quick anecdote since I've also been to Cuba. My very first trip to Cuba was on last year's May Day Brigade, which the National Network on Cuba organizes every year. Anyone's interested, you should come this year, come up to me and ask about it, or come to the Solidarity Travel Workshop after this. But the first moment I landed in Cuba, and even before I got to Cuba, you start to understand the impacts of the blockade just as you're packing for your trip. And when I landed at the airport, I met up with a Cuban musician. I was thinking about this because of the question about music. His name is Pablo Menendez. He's a part of a group called Mezcla, which has amazing music. Definitely check them out. But I met up with him to deliver him piano parts because even piano parts are blockaded by the US. And someone in London had to mail these to me in Boston, and I had to fly them to Cuba in order to deliver them to him so that he could, play with a tuned piano. And that really struck me because this is one of Cuba's most celebrated musicians. And he was telling me how he didn't even know how he was going to get home from the airport because he didn't have a car and because transport is so limited because of the fuel shortages because of the blockade. And that was, one of the very first interactions that I had in Cuba and has always stuck with me since. And he told me about this guy, El Médico de los Pianos from London, who made periodic trips to Cuba like over 20 times to go around the island and to repair people's pianos so that they wouldn't have to play on out of tune instruments as an act of resistance against the blockade and as an act of solidarity with Cuba. So it's incredible to see how music, how art, how culture are all part of this movement of resistance to the blockade and to bring people together across these barriers that our governments are trying to construct between us. Yeah, let me hand it back over to Shivani.
So everyone, ageism often tells us that youth are disheveled, but we are not. We are on time, everybody.
That's how you.
So with that being said, it appears that you will be able to take the 30-minute break you deserve.
Yes. Oh.
The others will end at 4:15 and the workshops will begin at 4:30. Please take a look at your schedules. Workshop 1 will be in 11B, and that is organizing the movement in the street. Workshop 2 is going to be, I believe, in this very room of 11C, resolutions and legislative outreach. And workshop 3, heavily promoted by my co-moderator here, is the solidarity travel, and that will be in 11D. So they will all be in this hallway. Please take time to refresh, to meet and greet, to discuss with our incredible panelists. Thank you so much for coming today.